Okay, open your notes to page 2. There is my famous hat that I mentioned last week. It was left by a miner, M-I-N-E-R. It was left by a miner in a mine, and they went back a little over 50 years later, and it was completely, totally fossilized, as hard as a rock, fossilized just like any other fossil. There it is. I mentioned it last week, and I wanted you to see that hat. So it took less than 50 years, or around 50 years, to turn a hat into a fossil. So it does not take millions and millions of years to form fossils. Now, we're looking at evidence or results of the flood. We hear a lot today about extinct animals. And I don't know, I just happened to get a headline on my phone, I don't know, a month or two ago, that the Supreme Court ruled that individual agencies can no longer interpret and make their own rules. Environmental Protection Agency is one of those that have ruled and reigned for a lot of years. They are the ones, if you wanted to build a house and you had a wet spot in your backyard, and there was a possibility, well, first of all, that wet spot could be called a marsh. And marshes are protected. You cannot build a house because the EPA said you would be destroying a marsh. So you could not build your house because of the EPA. They can no longer make their own rules. If there's a butterfly and that butterfly might become extinct, you can't do a thing to the trees behind your house because the EPA says this is a potentially extinct butterfly or any other animal. Supreme Court ruled that Congress is the only one that can make laws. So hallelujah, they stopped not only the EPA, but a whole bunch of agencies from just saying, and this happened, this was one of the things they overruled. It was not Congress, it was an agency that said, we are going to change the definition of a bumper stock. You know what that is? I'm sure you do. They just arbitrarily said, we're going to change the definition, make those illegal. They can't do that anymore. I just celebrating here. There's a million rules that Congress has to vote and say, this is now considered an illegal gun, not some independent agency. But getting back to extinct animals, in the fossil record, there are many, many, many animals that we don't have today. When was the last time you saw a dinosaur in your backyard? You've got a big field behind your house. You know, you've got that big field with the pond back there. That'd be a perfect place for a dinosaur. Well, dinosaurs are alive today, but most people don't see them and most people don't recognize them. Do you know what the word dinosaur actually means? Terrible or big lizard, means a big lizard or terrible lizard. So if you see a lizard, in essence, that's a little bitty dinosaur. There are other forms of dinosaurs, but for the most part, you're not going to find T-Rex in your backyard. You're not going to find, any of those big dinosaurs. They are extinct. How do we know they existed? We find fossils of them. We find, when I was working at AIG, it was a person who had dug up a full skeleton, complete skeleton of a T-Rex. And whoever bought it made a cast around the bones, made a cast mold of a full-size T-Rex. And working where we did, we got to go down, some of us anyway, got to go down and see this T-Rex. Those things are big. They weigh tons and tons. But we don't see, other than fossils, we don't see T-Rexes today. They are extinct. Means they died out. You don't find them today. Many animals have become extinct over the centuries that we have been keeping records. It's also true that animals are becoming extinct today. Buffalo, you don't find a whole lot of buffalo around. Can you imagine, instead of deer, shooting a buffalo, and then dragging it out? Do you deer hunt? I didn't think so. You don't either, do you? No, I don't either. But can you imagine dragging a buffalo out? It's very rare, very hard to find buffalo today. Some predictions are that they will be extinct if something doesn't happen to stop off. The African elephant, people shot them by the thousands to get their huge husk off of them, their ivory, to the point that they are on the verge of becoming extinct. It means there are no known species alive on the earth. Evolution says that dinosaurs became extinct millions and millions of years ago because a huge, gigantic meteorite hit the earth with such force that it sent shock waves all over the earth and killed all of the dinosaurs. Well, we know that didn't happen millions and millions of years ago. That's part of our world view. The earth is only 6,000 years old. So how did the dinosaurs die out? Does anybody make a wild guess? And you weren't here last week, so you're not responsible to know. What happened after the flood? There was this total change in atmosphere. It was one universal temperature. Now the canopy is gone. The sun rays are hitting directly, causing hot spots where the sun isn't shining, causing cold spots. We looked at the ice age. We looked at the ice caps. When dinosaurs came off of the ark, they're cold-blooded or warm-blooded? I guess they would have to be warm-blooded. With all the change in weather, they died. Most of them died, not all, but most of them died because of the tremendous change in weather. Now, how many of you were required to read, what was it, Beowulf in high school? You never had to read Beowulf? Oh, did you had to read Beowulf? Was that the dinosaur one, or actually they were called dragons? Or have I got the wrong book? Well, don't strain your brain too hard. Okay, so I am close. demonic? I graduated high school 55 years ago, so anything I learned has long been forgotten. But I do remember reading stories of mighty men fighting dragons. Dragons was the old English word. Today we call that same creature dinosaurs. Behemoth in Job. You know, when God said, have you considered Behemoth? My notes from Mr. Spurgeon, no, not Spurgeon, Schofield. Mr. Schofield says that Behemoth was probably an elephant. He had a tail like a tree. You ever seen an elephant's tail? I would hardly call that a tree. More than likely, from the description, it was a dinosaur. I don't remember which one. Which one? Yes, I think maybe that was it. Leviathan, fire-breathing. You know, he could light fires. Was probably a dinosaur. But they didn't know what a dinosaur was back in Job's day. So they just called it Behemoth, which is literally a translation of the Hebrew word, because they didn't know how to translate it. And Leviathan, same thing. They didn't have an English word to translate into, so they translated from the Hebrew. And today we read that, fire-breathing, dinosaur. Anyway, I could go all night on that one. Animals are going extinct. But they're finding fossils of animals that are supposed to be extinct, that are identical in every detail to animals that are still alive today. They're not extinct. They're still around. And it's interesting, if the fossils were formed millions of years ago, and a snail, you find a fossil of a snail, and you look at a snail today, they haven't evolved at all. They're identical. A snail 3 million years ago is identical to a snail today. That's called a living extinct fossil. They're living even though they're supposed to be extinct. Animals being stranded on certain continents. How is it? My wife and I went to Australia. I would go back in a heartbeat. You will never get her on a plane 16 hours from LA to Sydney over the ocean. You know, she kept saying, you know, if a car dies, you can pull over on the shoulder. If an airplane dies, there's no place to pull over. I said, that's why you need to make sure you're saved, honey, you know. But they have koalas. You ever seen a koala? We've got pictures of our daughter actually holding one. Platypus. You ever seen a platypus? You've seen one? In the zoo, okay. Basically, unless they brought it from Australia or someplace, you only find koalas in Australia, and you only find platypuses native in Australia. How come they made it to Australia and we don't find them in America? Koalas are the cuddliest little things. They are so cuddly, like a teddy bear. You know. Why don't we find koalas and kangaroos? Got to be really careful in Australia. Kangaroos will kick you and knock the breath out of you real quick. Why don't we find kangaroos in your woods? Why don't we find kangaroos on your farm? How did they get to Australia but nowhere else. It really isn't that complicated. Before the flood, the whole earth was connected as one supercontinent, super large. One continent covering almost the whole earth. During the flood and immediately after the flood, as the waters are receding, there would be land bridges. And so the animals, under the direction of God, would begin to spread out. Here's a land bridge going to Australia. Let's take that, see what happens. And then as the flood continued, or not the flood, the recovery from the flood, the land bridge collapsed. It sunk down at the bottom of the ocean somewhere. And now Australia is a completely separate continent. And the animals that made it there didn't make it anywhere else because the land bridge, collapsed. And so they are limited to Australia. And there are animals that you will find in different continents that are native to that continent. Did you know for years Australia did not have a single snake on the continent? When we flew into Sydney, they had to search to make sure we weren't snuggling a rattlesnake or something in. Somebody actually snuck one in, and now they have snakes in Australia. But there were no snakes at all in Australia. Land bridge collapsed before they could get across it. And we could go on and on and on. Fossils fully intact. We covered this whatever week you were here, because I remember you talking about, were you here last Wednesday? Okay. I can't keep up when you're, okay, all right. I showed you the tree standing upright through dozens and dozens of layers of fossils. Each layer is millions and millions of years old. And I did a lot of research today because I wanted to make sure that I had some clue what I was talking about. They have found full-grown mammals. They're not elephants, but they're similar to an elephant. Full-grown, buried completely intact. Their skin is still intact. They were buried and frozen. Some of them still were chewing grass when they were buried, frozen. Some, they've analyzed their stomachs. They still had fresh food in their stomach when they were buried by water and frozen in place. There are many examples of animals that were frozen in place with food still intact. How long does food last? Well, okay. Sunday, you weren't here Sunday, but Sunday he ate his Wheaties. He was sharper than a razor blade Sunday. I didn't know whether to preach or just keep laughing. I mean, it was hilarious Sunday. But they were frozen, standing up, eating, and frozen right where they stood. Now, evolution says it took millions of years. What happens to an animal that dies and it's exposed for millions of years while it's gradually freezing? Water's coming, freezing, water's rising, freezing, water rises, freezes. What happens to an animal that's exposed? You ever seen a deer on the side of the road after 1 or 2 days? Yeah, you get the picture. Animals have been found with cancer. You know, they have found cancer growing in certain fossilized animals. They have found animals with gum diseases and other stages of illnesses. Trees growing up through rock layers. Coal formed, by the way, you know how coal is formed? Don't read your notes. You know how coal is formed? Go ahead. Vegetation. Picture all the coal just in America. And that coal was formed as the flood sloshed and brought all of these millions and millions of trees and grass and everything and formed the coal that we have today. Kind of gives you an idea of how much vegetation was on the face of the earth. That's a lot of vegetation to form the coal that we have. I told my wife, we were talking today, growing up, we had a coal stove. That's it. That's all we had, was a coal stove. And Dad would order a big dump truck. They would dump it, and he would take a 5-gallon bucket, bring enough in to get us through the night. Next morning, he'd go out and get another 5-gallon bucket of coal. We were burning trees and things from before the flood. Now, do you know where gas comes from? Remember that commercial years ago, put a tiger in your tank? What company was that? What gas station? Put a tiger in your tank. If I knew, I wouldn't have asked. I put a tiger in your tank. Gulf? I don't remember, so I'll have to take y'all's word for it. Gas is formed by dead animals being compressed together and squeezing the oil, and literally when you fill up with gas, you're filling up your gas with dead animals that probably died during the flood. So when you fill up your car, you're saying this gas was formed from animals that died during the flood. Millions. Can you imagine how many animals it took to make 1 barrel of oil? And they pump 100 barrels a day, or no, it's more than that. Way more than that. How many animals were on the earth that the flood sloshed and brought them together, and then under tremendous pressure turned them into oil that we now have gas? So I remember Dr. Terrell, your uncle, by the way. Dr. Terrell used to have a nozzle from a gas pump, and he would say, the next time you fill up, you may be putting a tiger in your tank. But that's how coal was formed. That's how gas was formed. A lot of pressure over a short period of time. You know how diamonds are formed? And I'm not talking about the man-made artificial diamonds. I'm talking about real diamonds. Coal that was put under even more pressure until it changed that coal into a diamond. So if you're wearing a diamond, you're probably wearing part of a tree that was before the flood of Noah. Weighs like a tree sometimes, doesn't it? So, all of these things are very explainable. How are fossils formed? It requires, evolution said, it requires millions of years of dust settling in the air and the dust building up. Now, I've seen some houses that they were right on the verge of forming fossils. You know, there was so much dust. But dust, according to evolution, gradually builds up until it gets enough that it puts enough pressure that it changes into fossils. Well, we all know what happens to an animal or anything else. It usually requires rapid burial. You can't leave it exposed for millions of years, and it requires extreme pressure. And by the way, if you've got a world covered in water, it's 8 gallons, no, it's 8 pounds per gallon. And how many billions of gallons were there? Each gallon weighing 8 pounds. That's a lot of weight pressing down on the earth, turning animals and different things into fossils. Doesn't take millions of years. It can be done very quickly. That's why they've come out with man-made diamonds. They can make those in minutes almost. Fossils. Well, I said we would get into the dating methods. I spent most of the afternoon looking up dating methods, and I was going to give you a very brief, we'll have to do it next week, and then the next week will be Charles, Casey, you, or Bill, one of y'all. And I really trust all 4 of you, so all 4 of you have my blessing. Saturday, nothing. Sunday, back here. Fellowship meeting is a week from Saturday over at First Baptist of Independence. And if I don't find out before then, maybe I can get Brother Scott off to the side and find out what Nehemiah something or other is all about. It could be a good idea, but I've got 1,000 questions before I would want to